The pen trembles. Not from age, Mikhail Gorbachev is only 54, but from what the signature will unleash. It's March 1985, and the document before him authorizes something called Glasnost, openness. The word sounds harmless in Russian, almost quaint, like a grandmother's invitation. What no one in that room understands yet is that you cannot selectively unlock a system built entirely on sealed doors. The Soviet bureaucracy operates on compartmentalization, each ministry ignorant of the next. Transparency isn't reform, it's structural suicide. The Soviet Union doesn't collapse because of external invasion or economic collapse alone. It disintegrates because the very people trying to save it removed the three mechanisms that made survival: enforced silence, controlled scarcity, and the shared fiction that the system worked. These weren't accidental pillars. They were designed with the precision of a siege fortification, each reinforcing the other in ways the architects themselves barely understood. And Gorbachev's reforms, intended as renovations, turn out to be demolitions. Slow at first, then catastrophically start with. For 60 years, the Soviet state survived by controlling information with a paranoia that bordered on religious fundamentalism. Not just censorship of newspapers, though that existed, but the suppression of local knowledge. A factory manager in Leningrad couldn't know the production numbers of a factory in Kiev. Failure was a state secret, classified with the same rigor as missile trajectories. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was structural necessity. If you don't know your neighbor is also starving, you assume the problem is yours alone. Atomized suffering doesn't organize. It just suffers quietly, in isolation, blaming itself. Gorbachev believes the system is strong enough to tolerate honesty. This belief rests on a category error. He thinks the USSR is a country that happens to have secrets. In truth, it's a secret that happens to have a country, a fiction wrapped in flags and anthems. When he permits newspapers to publish the truth about Chernobyl, the first major test of Glasnost, the response isn't gratitude, it's rage. Not at the radiation, but at the decades of lies that preceded it, the accumulated betrayals now suddenly visible. A mother in Pripyat doesn't just learn her child is at risk. She learns the state she served knew about reactor design flaws and built it anyway, prioritizing propaganda over safety. This mirrors a pattern visible in modern institutions. Once trust breaks, it doesn't fragment. It inverts with a violence that surprises everyone. The same populations that tolerated dysfunction when they believed in good faith become ungovernable the moment they suspect bad faith. Gorbachev doesn't anticipate this because he's never experienced transparency. None of them have. The entire leadership class has spent careers navigating opacity, mistaking secrecy for strength, confusing control with legitimacy. The second pillar, controlled scarcity, unravels through a policy called perestroika, restructuring. The idea is simple: allow limited private enterprise to coexist with state planning. Let a farmer sell surplus potatoes at market prices. Let a mechanic open a small repair shop and keep the profits. Inject efficiency without surrendering control. On paper, it's pragmatic. In practice, it's hemlock administered by well-meaning doctors who don't understand the patient's actual diagnosis. The disease isn't inefficiency, but illegitimacy itself. The problem isn't that markets emerge. The problem is that they reveal the state-run economy to be a fiction, maintained by force and sustained only through collective denial. When a private baker in Tbilisi can produce better bread in 3 hours than the state bakery produces in a week, the question becomes unavoidable. What exactly has the state been doing for 70 years? The answer, rationing incompetence equally while punishing excellence, doesn't inspire confidence. Citizens who waited in line for 5 hours to buy soap now see those same goods appear in private kiosks within minutes, priced higher but available. The state didn't provide stability. It provided the illusion of fairness by making everyone equally deprived, calling poverty solidarity. To a Communist Party official in Moscow, perestroika looks like innovation, a clever synthesis of planning and dynamism. To a pensioner in Minsk watching prices climb while her fixed income freezes, it feels like betrayal, the final confirmation that her decades of sacrifice meant nothing. The social contract wasn't, "we'll make you rich," it was, "we'll keep you alive." Once the state stops guaranteeing even that baseline, the legitimacy evaporates. People don't demand better communism. They demand escape from it entirely by any means available. There's a photograph from 1989, grainy and poorly lit, showing a Politburo meeting in one of the Kremlin's smaller chambers. On the table, a stack of maps, edges stained with tea rings and cigarette ash, corners dog-eared from anxious handling. These aren't military maps, they're economic projections. The numbers are catastrophic: grain shortages, oil revenue collapse, debt to Western banks ballooning past $60 billion, with interest compounding faster than any plausible repayment schedule. Gorbachev's advisors understand the math. Without reform, the USSR has perhaps 5 years before total insolvency. With reform, they believe they buy time, maybe a decade, maybe enough to evolve into something sustainable. What they don't calculate is that reform doesn't delay the crisis. It accelerates it by destroying the third pillar, the shared fiction that held the entire apparatus together. Soviet citizens participated in an unspoken bargain, a cynical but functional dance performed daily across 11 time zones. You pretend the system works, and the system pretends to compensate you. You applaud the 5-year plan that never met its quotas. The state pretends your labor has meaning, that history will vindicate the sacrifice. This wasn't cynicism. It was survival through mutual delusion, a psychological architecture as essential as concrete. The moment Gorbachev permits criticism, the pretense becomes optional. And once pretense is optional, it becomes impossible to sustain even for those who want to. Factories don't just underperform. Workers openly mock the production targets in cafeterias and smoking areas, jokes spreading like contagion. Newspapers don't just report inefficiency. They publish satirical cartoons of communist officials, depicting them as buffoons rather than tyrants. The state doesn't crack down because Gorbachev has forbidden it, believing violence would discredit the reform project entirely. He believes exposure will motivate reform. Instead, it motivates exit, physical, psychological, and eventually political. Why fix a factory you've just learned was built on slave labor and lies, where every brick represents someone's stolen life? The Soviet intelligentsia, the engineers, the writers, the scientists who made the system function despite its contradictions, begin asking a question the state cannot answer. If we were lied to about Chernobyl, about Afghanistan, about the shortages, what else is a lie? The question metastasizes. By 1989, it's not just policy under scrutiny. It's the legitimacy of the Union itself, the founding myths, the entire historical narrative. Were the sacrifices necessary? Were the purges justified? Was any of it worth it, or just terror dressed as destiny? This dynamic repeats in every institution that relies on manufactured consent. Once the population stops believing the story, the institution doesn't gradually weaken. It evaporates with shocking speed. Faith isn't rebuilt through incremental honesty. It requires total reinvention, which Gorbachev either cannot or will not provide, because reinvention means admitting the entire project was flawed from inception. The alternative, doubling down on lies, would restore stability but betray everything he believes in. He's trapped between two forms of destruction, paralyzed by conscience. The final crack appears not in Moscow, but in the Baltic states, those small republics on the empire's western edge. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, absorbed by Stalin in 1940 through a pact they never consented to, used Glasnost as permission to speak what was always known but never sayable. We are occupied. In August 1989, 2 million people form a human chain spanning 420 miles from Tallinn to Vilnius. They hold hands, they sing, they don't throw a single stone or shatter a... Gorbachev, committed to non-violence and genuinely believing in self-determination, doesn't send tanks, a decision that will haunt the hardliners who eventually try to overthrow him. That restraint is mistaken for weakness by both separatists and loyalists, each drawing opposite conclusions from the same inaction. If the Baltics can leave, why can't Ukraine? Why can't Georgia, Kazakhstan, Armenia? Why can't anyone with a grievance simply walk away? The Union wasn't held together by shared ideology. Most Soviet citizens barely understood Marxism-Leninism beyond slogans memorized in school. It was held together by the credible threat of force and the absence of alternatives, both material and imaginative. Gorbachev removes the threat. The alternatives flood in: nationalism, capitalism, religion, anything that isn't this. There's a rusted key, now displayed in a Vilnius museum behind protective glass, that unlocked the door of a KGB archive in 1991. Inside, files documenting deportations, executions, the full machinery of state terror that maintained Soviet control across 7 decades. The key itself is mundane. Iron, slightly corroded, the kind you'd find on a janitor's ring or a clerk's desk drawer. But what it opens destroys the last pretense, the final argument that the suffering had noble purpose. Citizens don't just learn the state was harsh, they learn it was arbitrary, that the suffering had no higher purpose, that the terror was the system, not an aberration, but the foundation itself. By December 1991, when Gorbachev resigns and the Soviet flag lowers over the Kremlin for the last time, the collapse isn't a surprise to anyone paying attention. It's a formality. The country hasn't been conquered by external enemies. It's been abandoned from within, hollowed out by disbelief and exhaustion. Republic by republic, the constituent states simply stop participating in the fiction, declaring independence not with revolutionary fervor, but bureaucratic precision. The USSR doesn't die from external pressure. It dies because the people maintaining it, the bureaucrats, the soldiers, the factory managers, stop pretending it exists, stop showing up to the performance of Soviet power. Gorbachev's tragedy isn't that he was cruel or incompetent or corrupt. It's that he was sincere, perhaps the first genuinely sincere Soviet leader since Lenin himself. He genuinely believed transparency would strengthen the system, that citizens, once informed, would rally to fix it rather than flee from it. This belief ignored a fundamental truth. Systems built on lies cannot survive transparency without total transformation. They can only survive more lies or total transformation. Gorbachev chose neither. He chose honesty without accountability, openness without reckoning, reform without replacement. The worst possible combination for an empire built on fear. The lesson isn't that honesty destroys institutions, a simplistic reading that authoritarians love to invoke. It's that honesty destroys institutions built on dishonesty, revealing foundations that were always rotting beneath the facade. The Soviet Union was always collapsing, dying cell by cell from contradictions the ideology couldn't resolve. Gorbachev's reforms didn't cause the decay. They exposed it, peeled back the skin to reveal the cancer. But exposure in this case was indistinguishable from demolition, because the decay had progressed too far for any treatment except amputation. What remains isn't rubble, but a warning carved into the consciousness of anyone who studies institutional collapse. You cannot repair a foundation while people are still living in the house, trusting its walls. The moment you reveal the cracks, they either flee or demand you burn it down and start over, accept nothing less than rebuilding from zero. Gorbachev wanted renovation. His citizens, after 70 years of cold and hunger and lies, wanted annihilation, not out of nihilism, but out of desperate hope that something better might emerge from the ashes. They got it. Not through revolution, but through the quiet, cumulative refusal to pretend anymore, a general strike of belief. The pen stops trembling. The signature is complete, ink drying on paper that will outlive the state it tried to save. And with it, the longest experiment in enforced belief comes to an end, not with tanks or missiles, but with the simple, irreversible act of telling the truth to people who'd forgotten what truth sounded like and could no longer unhear it once spoken.